there will not be a standard rotation for Magic the Gathering in 2023. Hi, I'm Amy the Amazonian, and I am just as confused as you are. During this weekend's Pro Tour coverage, Wizards of the Coast announced that there was going to be a change to how rotation works. Now, if you don't play Standard, you might be wondering, well, what is rotation? Rotation is when we have a group of sets, typically 4 sets, leave Standard as we welcome in a new Standard set. In the case of this fall, it was going to be that we would be losing Innistrad Midnight Hunt, Innistrad Crimson Vow, Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, and Streets of New Capenna. So those 4 sets would be leaving at the time when we got Wilds of Eldraine. So that would mean that we would still have 4 sets plus the new set and whatever you want to call Aftermath, this mini set, in Standard post-rotation. But they have decided to move away from that system and instead go on to a longer cycle. The way it currently works is whatever kicks off that new rotation is the set that's going to be in rotation the longest, and it's going to stick around for around 2 years. But now it's going to be 3 years. So the cards which you remember, you know, you love, or you hate from 3 years ago are still going to be in the format until they hit rotation. So the reasons for this are outlined vaguely in an article called Revitalizing Standard, which I'll get back to in just a second, but I just want to bring up what that means. Maybe you were watching the Pro Tour coverage this weekend and you were like, wow, there sure is a lot of Fable of the Mirror Breaker. I sure do look forward to that card leaving Standard in about 4 months. No, you don't get to have that, because unless they ban the card, it's going to be around for another year and a third. This is strange. This is unusual. This is not something I fully want. I feel like I enjoy Standard having a rotation because it means that decks are capped at a certain power level. Yes, your tools are limited for deck building, but if you want more deck building tools, you can go into other formats like Pioneer or Modern, or if you want to go all the way back, we've got things like Vintage Legacy and Commander. Now, Commander has probably been the #1 growing format. It's the focus for a lot of new card designs, and also it's kind of getting out of hand, which is why I'm going to go back to that article I mentioned before. This is Revitalizing Standard. This is a little announcement article that came out at the same time as the announcement during the Pro Tour stream. So this Revitalizing Standard article comes out actually with a quote. This is a tweet from Aaron Forsyth, who wrote this article, and I actually replied to this tweet. So I'm going to read it out. It's, over the past few years, Standard play has dried up in many stores. I have my own list of possible reasons. I'd love to hear from you about your store community. Why has sanctioned Standard play declined relative to other formats in your store? Well, near me, I can tell you that #1, there was this whole pandemic thing going on. #2, Pioneer exists. It's a lot of fun, and it costs about the same as Standard these days. And #3, we're busy playing Commander. To be honest, you have pushed Commander so hard that it feels like almost every card that I've been checking out and said, ooh, how neat, has actually been a Standard card second and a Commander card first. So I also want to bring up, here is the tweet itself, a lot of Magic pros and professional players and other content creators like me replied to this tweet. You have things like guys saying maybe it's because Standard decks are $300 to $400. I said the same thing, but for me, I was like, it's like $500 to $600. Are you playing those Meat Hook Massacres and those Shoulders? Because, sheesh, I'm glad Meat Hook Massacre is gone, because that thing was pricey. Now we have some other people talking about how Standard was hard to keep up with meta-wise because the meta moves so quickly because it's driven by Arena. Arena is primarily a Standard play space, so, you know, people will drive deck innovations there. And then if I get to scroll down enough here, you've got... Where's me? Ah, here we go. I actually replied twice, apparently. I must have, like, forgotten and been like, I want to play Commander, but also I can't afford to just buy Standard decks, and part of that is how quickly they rotate. So that is brought up in this article here. Yes, people want to play with their cards for longer because they're expensive. People don't want to have to buy a new deck when rotation happens or where a powerful new block comes out. But also, that's part of the price of playing Standard. I feel like something that would make more sense would be to make it so key staples that do have to stick around throughout a format, like, I don't know, dual lands, are uncommon instead of rare. I've heard a lot of people say the same thing, and I think it would be amazing, though it would probably drive fewer pack sales, and, you know, Wizards of the Coast is a little bit profit-driven at times, most of the time. And that's fine. Like, I get it. You want to sell packs. That's how we pay the designers, and that's also how we make Big Daddy Hasbro happy. So this announcement means that Standard is going to be more stagnant, but it will have the potential for more experimental decks, because you'll have decks from across more sets. So, for example, it's mentioned down here, Green-White Toxic or Blue-White Soldiers might get additional pieces as this standard expands. And that does make sense. Toxic, I guess, could get more proliferate pieces. They could print more cards with Toxic, though I kind of doubt they will unless they have a core set. Or maybe just some cards happen to have soldiers as a creature type, or zombies or vampires. These other tribes tend to get bigger as they have more supporting cards. But this is not necessarily great, because if I wanted to just have more cards for my format, I would go play Pioneer. And I love Pioneer. A lot of you have noticed that I play Explorer occasionally on my stream, because Explorer is like, it's pseudo Pioneer, and I'll take it. I know it's not the same, but you gotta take what you can get. So Wizards of the Coast wants to make Standard more big. They want more people to play it outside of Arena specifically, and this is what they think will help drive it. Now, they also mentioned that article that they're going to be doing some other things to help revitalize Standard. Well, personally, the way I would like to revitalize Standard is to have, sure, more cards, that's fun, but how about more bans? So the good part about banning cards is we don't have to see them. You get rid of Fable the Mirror Breaker, you get rid of Shuldred, you get rid of whatever the problem cards happen to be, the things that people don't enjoy playing with, and you'll see more deck innovation. The meta will again settle, but you'll have that leeway, they'll have that period where you can then experiment. Now, that takes frequent bans, and bans make players sad because they bought cards either through Arena, they crafted them with wild cards, or they opened up packs, and in paper they either purchased the cards directly, or they traded for them, or they opened the packs to get them, but they got the cards, and they put their time and their effort into building the deck, and if you ban a piece of that deck, the value of your deck goes down. Now, Wizards of the Coast can't acknowledge the secondary market directly, because that opens up gambling lawsuit potential and like turning things into loot boxes rather than game pieces, and it's a whole bunch of issues. But I still think that if cards were cheaper and we banned them more often, then we could have a more fun game. Now, I feel like this is actually what Alchemy could have been doing. Now, a lot of you were like, I hate Alchemy on the grounds of digital cards shouldn't exist and I hate them. Cool, good for you. I think that Alchemy should have been a cheaper to enter format than Standard. It should have had frequent rebalances, which they're not exactly the same as bans, but they were close enough. You could be like, and Childred's a 3/3 now for 4 mana. She still has Death Touch, what are you complaining about? She's still great. Now, we move things around, you shuffle them around, and it would be this weird, ever-changing format, but because the price to enter it was the same as Standard, and having your decks rebalanced means you'd have to buy more cards from new decks, it was actually a worse version of Standard. Now, they've added a lot more cards into Alchemy. I should do a separate video about that. It's a failure. It didn't work out, and I feel like the best thing to come out of Alchemy has been cards for Historic Brawl. So now, moving back into this rotation, I don't want to deal with the same cards for 3 years, and I bet a lot of you don't either. I'm going to keep bringing up Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Fable of the Mirror Breaker, I actually thought was on the potential cutting board when they banned Meat Hook Massacre. I was thinking like, oh, well, Meat Hook Massacre, and it's been in the meta for multiple months. People have a chance to play with it. Same with Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's a little bit newer, but, you know, people will want to spend money on new packs, and they will still be buying them to get cards like Shuldred versus something like Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's hard to get Kamigawa packs at this point. So what are they going to ban? They ended up banning Meat Hook Massacre. That was to hinder the Rakdos decks, which are still a dominant force in Standard a year later. I'm going nuts, it feels like, because we've been around this road before. We've dealt with the exact same, like, Shouldered Fable decks, and they're still around and they're going to be around for a lot longer unless something gets removed from the format, which rotation was supposed to do, but now it's not going to do because we're not having a rotation until next year, until 2024. I can't wait that long. Now, do I think Wizards of the Coast is going to start banning things more heavily? Maybe. If they want people to move back towards paper play, as I mentioned before, frequent bans are kind of bad for that because it discourages people to commit to a deck. But it's fine in something like Arena where, yeah, you get the wildcard refunds, but also you can just build a lot more decks in a place like Arena. Like, for example, if I put $100 into Arena for each set, I can pretty much build every single card in that set. If I put my money into drafting through gems and I maybe get a 50% win rate, I can build a collection. I can't do that so much in paper. I could buy maybe one deck for $100 and it would be bad. Like, it would be a bad deck. A budget deck right now, I think Mono Blue would probably be the best budget deck. Mono Red is pretty cheap too if you're buying it in paper. But it's monocolored decks because those gosh darn dual lands are always so pricey. Yes, the new and the old dual lands that are being played in Standard are pricey. There's the bulk of the cost of a lot of decks outside of things like Sheoldred, which costs, oh my gosh, I want to say she's like $40 to $60 right now. The number just keeps going up, and part of that is because cards like Fable and Mirror Breaker and Sheoldred are actually playable in lots of formats. And I don't just mean Standard and Pioneer and Modern, I mean Commander. Sheoldred is a house in Commander, because you know what you do in Commander? You draw cards. And what happens when you draw cards with a Sheoldred out in the battlefield? Well, if it's your Sheoldred, you gain life, and if it's somebody else's Sheoldred, you lose life. And that results in it being a great card for Commander. So people are going to buy the card for Commander and Standard and Pioneer and anywhere else it happens to see play, which leads to supplies going down, prices going up, and now it's unaffordable to build a Standard deck. Now, is it terrible that they're building for Commander and Standard? Sometimes. It's kind of frustrating when I look at a new set and I go from thinking, wow, what an interesting way that I can play with this card Unlimited, to, hey, wait a minute, this is a Commander. I guess I'm going to build this as a Commander now. Sure, it fits an archetype that I want to build, or a Historic Brawl Commander because I really like Historic Brawl. Instead of just being like, ooh, limited play, ooh, standard play, those should be at the forethought of my mind, and they're not. I'm too busy thinking about Commander because they pushed it so hard. They made it into this king of a format. It's really fun, but they left Standard by the wayside, so it's a little bit harder for people to get into, stay into, etc. It kind of feels like there's no winning for players if we have to fear more bans, because that's how you balance a bigger Standard. Now, I am hopeful that they start releasing core sets again, because I do think that that would be a great way to balance out Standards. If they release more cards that don't necessarily fit a single theme or have a certain mechanic like they would in a regular set, and they have a core set instead, or replacement core set, but something that is acting as a core set, then you're able to supplement tribals. You're able to get more cards that maybe boost up slightly less powerful archetypes, and you can even print out some hate cards, which can either be put into decks or on sideboards to target those meta decks which have come out through the last few years. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the design cycle from Wizards of the Coast, but I know some people who work on the design team, and they talk about this stuff on Twitter and in person, and they've even had some talks recorded on YouTube or during weekly MTG. The way it works is about a year and a half before we even see the first cards from the set, everything's locked in. And the groups designing those sets might not actually be talking with each other that much because they can't. So you might have whoever was designing Kamigawa Neon Dynasty only having a little bit of overlap with the people designing Streets of New Capenna. Just two sets next to each other, could be completely different teams, could have some overlap. So it means that they might not actually have a chance to be like, oh, well, you've got this cool thing going on here. We're going to be also having some interplay. I'm sure there's some talk between those teams, but it's not 100% collaborative because that would take too long and they just don't have the manpower or the time, or they don't commit the time to it. Now, when it comes to having more sets, that means that over time they'll be able to see things as they move into release, and they'll have a chance to put cards in to target things. So let's say you've got a year and a half, it's been locked in, it's releasing, and then it would rotate out within like a year or so of it coming out. Now, since you've got 3 years to work with instead of just 2 years, you've got an entire year more to add to that design cycle, to add in more cards, to change standard, to boost lower power decks, to maybe even include those hate cards I mentioned before. I'll have to see how it turns out, but that is a cool way they could be using this longer design cycle. I want to know, how long was this in progress? Why did they decide to not have a rotation this year rather than announce it this year and then not have a rotation next year? Which I kind of feel like might make more sense, or even 2 years out. I guess they just really wanted to act on it as quickly as possible. It's possible that this has been something that Wizards of the Coast has known that they were going to do for months, and they just couldn't tell us because they wanted to get the timing right, which was, I guess, the last major standard tournament before rotation, except now we're not having rotation. And yeah, you know what? It's fine. This is the only rotating format we have, so please don't ruin it, Wizards of the Coast. I want to play it. I enjoy standard. I like building jank, and my favorite kind of jank is the sort that loses a lot of games, especially to those meta decks, so I can only play it for a few days when the cards are fresh and nobody's figured anything out. So yeah, standard, it's happening. By the way, if you ever want a sweet graphic on what's in standard, I'm going to point you to what'sinstandard.com. What'sinstandard.com, props to whoever runs this website. They updated this interface the day after the announcement was made for the changes to rotation to accommodate the new timeline. Now, what'sinstandard.com is just a great resource to be like, okay, what's in standard? Also, what's rotating? And when's it rotating? It's very nice to have a tool like this that I can point newer players to explain what standard is, what they can play. And as we get into this complicated switchover, it'll be important to point people to this site, because a lot of folks are going to be like, what do you mean there's no rotation? They're not going to believe you, and they're not going to read through an entire article that Wizards of the Coast released. They're just going to be like, yeah, well, I think it's illegal that you have Kamigawa cards in your deck, and they'll have to call a judge, and the judge will make them feel bad because they're wrong. But it's you know what? It's not their fault. Before I end this video, I do want to ask, what are decks that you would like to see made more powerful with this longer standard? Is there an archetype you play that you want to see have more cards? Also, what are the archetypes you want to see made weaker? Maybe Esper Legends is your boogeyman. Maybe you really hate mono white control, all those wanderers wandering around. If there's something you love, something you hate, something you want to see grow, something you want to see shrink, you should let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video and listening to me rant about Magic the Gathering. And since we can't have a real rotation, I'm going to give you one right here in this video. Let's